Tonight we're going to take on the resurrection of Jesus. And we're in such a skeptical age, aren't we? I just did a little bit of research. Almost 10% of Americans don't think we went to the moon. I don't know about the statistics on this. I've just read enough stuff. I know a lot of people think that we're hiding aliens somewhere, Area 51.
On the moon where we landed.
And then, yeah, maybe on the moon. And then I've seen this number kind of all over the place, but I've seen reports up to half the people think 9/11 was an inside job. It was a way to get us involved in the Middle East.
It was.
So we've got all this skepticism, and now we talk about the resurrection, but we want to talk about it, don't we? I mean, think about what...
Faith is based on that.
Yeah, think what Paul said in 1 Corinthians. He said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we're to be pitied because we're wasting our time. We're just coming here and singing nice songs and huddling up with people and saying nice to see you. I mean, it's kind of a waste of time. You could be at the beach, you could be doing some real seriously fun things, you know, if this isn't true. This is the cornerstone of Christianity. This is it.
That's it.
Otherwise, it's just a bunch of rules and regulations. Well, every religion's got its rules and regulations. What's the point? So it's got to be defended, and that's what we're going to try to do a little bit tonight. And the first thing people think of is, well, let's go to the Bible. Say, look, you know, look what it says in Genesis, or not Genesis, I got Genesis on my brain. Look what it says in Matthew or Mark or something like that. Do you see any problems doing that, though, having the Bible as your key defense?
People don't believe the Bible's real.
There you go. Who believes it anymore? And the ones that are kind of curious, they don't have any Bible knowledge. We're in a biblically illiterate period of time. At Palomar, once in a while, we'll come across an allusion in something that the students are reading, and once in a while it's a biblical allusion, you know, to Abraham or something. I say, how many of you know who Abraham is? Dead silence. It's so depressing. They don't know David. They don't know Abraham. They don't know anything. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the Bible to us is vitally important, and we're going to touch on it several times tonight. So I'm not saying put your Bible away. I mean, if people are open to that, great, use the Bible. But what I'd like to do tonight is to show that the resurrection actually makes the best sense of history. It's the most logical way to interpret the kinds of things that happened at that time. So that's going to be kind of our focus. In fact, I'm going to use more than one approach. If you like one of them, fine, go with that. I'll send you an outline after tonight. You may find one more effective than the other. Okay, I'm getting a lot of this, probably half of it from that God book that I was telling you about, the God Conversation. So you can look it up in there. But I'm adding some other things that I found I think are a lot of fun. So here's approach number one. This is the thing you're going to hear pretty often. It's a lie. It was a lie. It was cooked up by the disciples and the early writers of the church. It was just a big lie. However, I want to illustrate that's a huge problem for the people that suggest it's a lie, because it goes against all of the things you want to do if you want to create a really good lie. So there are 5 steps that they say, this is in the God Conversation book, that make for a good lie. So maybe we're going off in a weird direction tonight. You're going to come out of here thinking, okay, how do I get away with lies? But number one is you got to make sure it benefits you. Why would you tell a lie that puts you in a bad light or costs you money or friendships or things like that? I mean, you want to get out of a tough situation. That's what lies do. It builds you up. So remember, the God Conversation book depends on examples and illustrations. So I'm going to give you a lot of examples tonight. So, do you recognize these 2 people? Elizabeth Holmes, she just got recently put in jail. She's holding up this little vial. She claimed that she had a new blood testing device that would take a little tiny sample, just a drop of blood, and can do all sorts of tests on that. And people said, great, you know, instead of draining people for 5, 6, 8, 10 vials of blood, how great would that be? It'd be done fast, and she said these machines are going to be wonderful. Her stock prices went crazy. Can you see what she's starting to, I didn't get her whole body here, but she became kind of a female Steve Jobs. She started wearing the black turtlenecks. So, you know, Steve Jobs' company, of course, is shot off the charts, and her company was getting big. People bought into it, and they were really excited about it, and then they found out it didn't work. It didn't work at all. But for a while, she was the toast of, I mean, she's on Forbes magazine, the cover of Forbes magazine. That's a pretty big magazine. How about this guy? Bernie Madoff, the ultimate pyramid scheme guy, right? But these people were doing these things to build themselves up, to get money and to get fame and all this kind of stuff. So here's the question. Let's go back to the resurrection appearances. So did the disciples make out like bandits on this deal? No. Well, they got cut out of their whole society. I mean, the Jewish society was all about togetherness, right? It was them against the rest of the world, but they were cut off. They weren't allowed to go in the synagogue and things like that. A lot of ridicule. It got worse, didn't it? Torture, death. Sean McDowell has a book out now about the fate of the disciples, and it's pretty grim, you know, things that happened to them. So lying, it didn't benefit them at all. Why would they do it? That makes no sense. Here's number 2. If you're going to create a good lie, try not to mention anything specific. Why? Somebody's going to check on it and go, what? All right, so here's my example. You may not recognize this guy. Years back, I read a book. It was called Catch Me If You Can. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay, that's Frank Abagnale. I guess that's how he pronounces his name. Now, when I read it, I thought, this is amazing. The guy claims to have been in and out of prison. He was writing bad checks. He built himself a Pan Am uniform, pretended to be a pilot, pretended to be an attorney, pretended to be a doctor, walked around hospital rooms. He'd look at charts and people would be standing there and he'd go, uh-huh. And he'd scribble stuff, but he never really touched the patients and did any surgeries or anything like that. But they accepted him. And so I read that. I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Well, it's been revealed in the last 5-10 years it was all made up. Because he had names of prisons, he had names of hospitals, he had names of where he went for his law practice and things like that. So somebody went and found all that stuff out. He wasn't there. He didn't do it. He wasn't part of that. So his whole thing just fell apart. Because he put some details in there that he probably shouldn't have. So if you're going to tell a lie, don't put any details. You recognize Brian Williams? He used to be the big wheel on, I think it was NBC, he was the news guy. And then he made a claim. He said he was in a helicopter in Iraq when the war was going on, and they got shot down, and he got rescued by Americans, and it's a great story. The only catch is, it was false. So he's off the air. He said, okay, pull the plug, I'm done. So here are 2 people that made the mistake of having actual places and names and dates and things like that. You don't want to do that when you tell a lie. So think about the disciples. Did they mention specifics? When you read the New Testament,
Yes.
yeah, they named somebody that was big deal in that society, right? One of the leaders of the community, and said he was involved in this resurrection appearance. Well, so you could go check it. They said, Paul says there were 500 that witnessed that. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. It took place in a specific place. You could go check it out. It was Jerusalem. And then you've got all these other names, Pilate, you've got Ananias, you've got, who's the high priest? Caiaphas, yeah. By the way, they found Caiaphas' bone box. Isn't that cool? Actually connected with the Bible. So they give you actual places in there to say, go check it out. And so if you're going to make a lie up, you don't do stuff like this. You don't put specifics in here. Step 3. Now, I don't think you're going to recognize her, but you want a credible source to back you up. You want to say, well, so-and-so vouches for me. I went to this school. I'm in this position in whatever, some company or all, whatever. Marilee Jones became, what's that name of that school back east? MIT. She was the MIT admissions director. So it was a pretty big job, pretty good job. And she claimed in her resume that she had 3 different university degrees. And she named the universities. They're very prestigious. I don't remember what they were, but probably Ivy League and things like that. So they hired her. And then they looked into it. If she just said, Schmuckville University in some place nobody's ever heard of, they probably wouldn't have checked on that. Say, okay. But she named them. That was her credibility on the line there to back herself up. Well, then they checked with these major universities, and that wasn't true at all, so she's lost her job. So find a credible source. Now, you go to the Gospels. Did they use credible sources? They used women. Not only by getting offended at me, we're talking about first century Judaism. How'd they treat women? No good at all. In fact, there's a statement made, blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female. That was the idea, right? Women were just second rate all the way through. You wouldn't trust a woman's testimony. And so who does the gospel mention in there? Not the guys, the women. Now you wouldn't do that if you're making a lie up, because you're getting the wrong people behind you for that. How about the disciples? So they're witnesses as well. Are they high up members of their society? You got a tax collector. Oh, wonderful. How do the Jews like tax collectors? Lower than low, right? And then they've got fishermen, right? This is it. This is about all you got. Well, we got fishermen, tax collectors, and women. What do you think? So their use of credibility behind them was not there. Why would they do that? Because it really happened. Here's step 4 of a great lie. Watch out for those fact checkers. Somebody's liable to come along if you don't cover your tracks real well and expose what you're talking about. So here's another guy. He wrote a book. This guy's name is James Fry. He wrote a book as a novel first, and nobody bought it. So he reworked it, and he said it really happened to me. It tells about his drug addiction. He goes to jail. He fights guys off. It's terrible there. And he's in a life of crime. And then he gets sober, so it's got a wonderful ending. Oprah was so impressed with that book. She endorsed it, which of course is a guarantee of selling really, really well. However, there's an organization called the Smoking Gun. I hadn't heard of them, but they're apparently a website that check. Have you heard of them? Yeah. Okay. So it's a website that checks up on facts to say, is this legit? Well, they looked into it and it wasn't true. So it's all, he's had to backtrack on all of that. Let me share 2 other people you may recognize here.
Wow.
By the way, I'm trying to be fair. So CNN did some fact checking. So one time Trump said, if you can follow the logic here, Trump said that Biden had claimed to be an airline pilot. And CNN looked into it and said, no, he never claimed that. Okay, so that was a problem for him making that comment. Okay, let's be fair. Biden claimed that during the 6-day war, when Israel was fighting the Arabs, that Biden said, I went over and talked to Golda Meir, who was the premier at the time, and I was going to act as a liaison between Egypt and Israel, to be a go-between. Didn't happen. CNN found that out. So good for them. I mean, at least they found problems on both sides. So you just want to be really careful if you're going to make up a lie. People may investigate your claims. Did anybody investigate the claims of the resurrection? Yeah. Guess who? The Jews. The leaders of the Jewish faith. I mean, think about it. That was their religious belief that was being challenged by this guy that claimed to be the Messiah. They didn't want their Messiah to look like that and to do those kinds of things. So they're going, no. We're going to check it out. So they have the whole power of the Jewish state to go check this thing out. It weakened all of their power, didn't it? Jesus was always going against them, much more so than the sinners in the society. There are other non-Christians outside of the Jewish faith even, that have investigated this. And I think out of them, Josephus is my favorite. He was a first century Jewish historian, not a believer. And he investigated all this. He wrote right after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He saw which way the wind was blowing, and he became a Roman puppet. He didn't fight to the death. He looked at it and he said, there are a lot of Romans out there. And so he went to the Roman side and became poster boy for the Romans. So he then wrote the history of the Jewish people. And he mentions Jesus, and he mentions his brother James. And so he knows the story. If it was a made-up story, he would have found out. Why would he put that in his history? He's trying to be a good, authentic historian. Then you got a couple of Roman historians that looked at it as well. So I'll keep moving here. Here's step 5. There may be that time where somebody is catching you in the lie, and you better save your neck. You better backpedal. You better shove the blame somewhere else. Do something to get yourself off the hook. So here are 2 of my favorites. Do you recognize this guy? John Dean. From the Watergate period. John Dean was one of those that was caught up in the whole Watergate controversy and conspiracy. Well, he bailed fast. All of a sudden he's saying, I'll be glad to testify. and he ratted out everybody else that he could and got off pretty light. Jussie Smollett, you probably know the first half of the story, but I don't know if you know the second half. I got to find that here because it's pretty interesting. Do you guys know the story about him?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so he claimed that he was the victim of a racist attack.
Oh,
So then they find out there wasn't no truth to that at all. And the city sued him for $100,000 because of all the wasted police time. Okay, here we go. Now, it looks pretty bad for him. So what does he do? He gets his lawyers together. He countersues the city of Chicago, and he claims this, that he was the, quote, victim of mass public ridicule and harm. So what's he doing? He's now the victim. So he's trying to get out of that spot there. So we see that a lot. Shift the blame. Put it on somebody else. So did the disciples cut a deal? No. They never turned on each other. There are no confessions. Hey, all right, don't wave that knife at me or anything. Whatever, you know, it was all just made up. There's no public disavowal of the resurrection out of all these guys. And here's what Chuck Colson had to say about it. You recognize the name Chuck Colson? He was part of the whole Watergate thing, went to jail. So Colson says, the Watergate cover-up proves that 12 powerful men in modern America couldn't keep a lie, and that 12 powerless men 2,000 years ago couldn't have been telling anything else but the truth. It's a good comment. So since we're still talking about lies, then some people say, well, wait a minute. Couldn't it be that, all right, so maybe the disciples never said anything, and it was actually 300 years later, 400 years later, when the church got some power, that they looked back and said, let's create some cool stories about our founder. We don't know much about him. There's a guy named Jesus, and we just kind of heard these stories floating around. Let's make up some really good things about Jesus. So, did they lie and create a Jesus of the resurrection and a Jesus who shows up afterwards? No, that we can trace the church fathers, the people that came on right after the disciples passed away, and they kept that story going, and the story never changed. It was called a chain of custody. One would teach the next, who would teach the next, who would teach the next. And they can follow this. You can find this online. You know, who did Paul talk to? Who did John have as his disciple? And whose disciple was he? The story never changes. It's always the resurrection. It doesn't get changed and all of a sudden it pops up hundreds of years later. If you're going to start this story 300 or 400 AD and you're going to say Peter is our pope, he's our leader, are you going to create stories where Peter looks like an idiot? That doesn't make any sense either. You would have him be the shining guy, the go-to guy, the one that would help Jesus out and fight off the Romans and do all this kind of stuff and be the first one on Sunday morning saying, hard to wait to see the resurrection. That isn't what you get there. If you're creating this stuff in the 300s, you would probably want your Jesus to say things about what's important then, like church structure. So Jesus would say, verily, verily, have bishops and have this and collect the tithes. And I mean, Jesus doesn't talk about anything that's church-oriented by the 300 or 400. So if you're going to make this stuff up, you'd want it to tie into what their church is doing at that time. By the way, I think this is a real killer. If they're writing this in the 300 or 400s, how did they know what was going on in the 0 to 100 time period? A lot of things changed, like Luke talked a lot about the different people that were called governors of an area or the city founders or the ones who were in power. They all had different terms, different names, because these were like little city states. They all called their leaders by different names. Well, Luke got all that right because he was first century. John talked about at the Pool of Bethesda, he said there were 5 colonnades. But Jerusalem was destroyed. If you're going to write this stuff in the 300s, how would you know there were 5 colonnades? So they got, if they did this in 300, they made some amazing guesses about the first century. Here's one more thing that I think is kind of interesting. There's a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. You might like that. He spends a lot of time talking about names. You know how names kind of come and go in popularity? Like nobody names their kids Gary anymore. After World War II, they didn't name their kids Adolf. That kind of lost popularity there. So they took the names that are in the New Testament, like Simon and Mary and Martha and things like that, and they've got other sources to find out what were the most popular names in the first century not from Bible sources, but other sources, and it parallels really well. Simon went out of favor years and years later, and Mary went out, So the names that were in the first century, that really occurred in the first century, are the names you can encounter in the gospel stories.
Jesus was a popular name, wasn't it?
Yeah. So there's some reasons why you can say it doesn't make sense that it would have been 300 years and then they decide they're going to tell some stories about Jesus. Here's approach number 2. So I'm done with the lie thing from the God conversation. I came across this. I'm going to go pretty quickly over it. You recognize the name Josh McDowell?
Yes.
Okay. Father of Sean McDowell. He's been all over the place doing apologetics. So he wrote this short article. I'm just going to whiz through it here, but I think it's kind of interesting. So Josh McDowell, if I had faked the resurrection, number 1, he says, let some time go by before you publish your account. Right? Let people's memories kind of dim and do it 50 years later, 75 years later, 100 years later. We'll talk in a couple of minutes about the time jump between Jesus' resurrection and the accounts. It's way closer than you may even have thought of. He says distance. Publish your account way off from wherever the stuff was supposed to take place. So if I say that I saw Steve perform a miracle of some kind over in San Marcos, you can say, really? I know people in San Marcos. And all of a sudden that thing falls apart pretty quickly. But if I say, I know this guy in Africa and he was able to raise the dead, you'd say, well, that seems odd. But you wouldn't necessarily know because it's so far away, right? But where did the disciples and all start their preaching? Jerusalem.
Hometown.
Yeah, that's ground zero where the resurrection took place. Here's something else he says. Select your witnesses carefully. Well, we've already covered that. Apparently the Bible didn't do a very good job at that. They have the women, they have the disciples. He says if you're going to do a lie, he says you ought to have the event surrounded with all these majestic things, choirs singing and stuff like that. But the resurrection was kind of low key, wasn't it? Just Sunday morning, and all of a sudden the women are coming back telling the disciples. They didn't say, yeah, we figured as much because there's lightning in the sky and there's a big sign that said Jesus is risen. I mean, you didn't get that. He says, number 5, make all the people involved seem heroic. Didn't happen, did it? Where were the disciples? Running from Jesus, running from the Romans, running from the Jews, hiding out, panicky. Peter's denying Jesus. I don't know him. 3 times. I don't know him. I don't have anything to do with him. Why are you talking about that? This is really the hero you want? And then location. You ought to keep the location of the tomb kind of quiet. Don't make a big deal of that. Or better yet, I like this idea. Say, it got taken up to heaven. Oh, okay, so you can't find it. It reminds me of those golden plates.
Joseph Smith.
Joseph.
Where are those golden plates? They're not here, not available. Take it on faith, burning in the bosom. You got to pray about it. Okay, so that's the second approach. Here's the third one. We've got 2 new attacks that are going on toward the resurrection. One is it's a legend. Right? It's just kind of accumulated over time. It wasn't the church in the 300s. It was people in the 100s and 200s and 300s. And they just kept adding stories to this. And then the second one is, it's the famous hallucination theory. So we're going to cover those 2 real briefly. So is it a legend? Well, legends don't really give you a lot of detail for the most part. I mean, you think about Bigfoot. It's kind of here and it's kind of there, and we're not really exactly sure what's going on. King Arthur, where's Avalon? I don't know. Where was Camelot? I don't know. Paul Bunyan, there's your American legend. But J. Warner Wallace, you recognize that name? I think Steve and I have probably talked about him. He wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. He was a cold case detective. He was challenged by Rick Warren to say Jesus was a really sharp guy. You ought to find out about him. So he bought the cheapest Bible possible because he thought, well, I can just throw it away if it doesn't pan out. He started reading the gospel stories. He said, oh, he's had years of dealing with eyewitnesses. He said that those 4 books, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they've got so many details. He said, that's got to be legit. And somebody else who agreed with him is C.S. Lewis. Here's what Lewis said. Lewis is, by the way, he's a literary genius. I've read a lot of his stuff. And I don't mean his Christian stuff. He was a teacher, and so he would teach Old English works, poetry and things like that. That's what he says here. He says, I've been reading poems and romances and all this stuff. And legends, he says, all my life, I know what they're like. Yeah, he's published. He was a very famous professor. I know none of them are like this. He's talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. He says, of this gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, in other words, it's legit, it happened, and you're just writing down what people are telling you happened, or else some unknown ancient writer without any known, he says, predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern, novelistic, realistic narrative. He says, no, don't put your money there. Put it on the first thing. This is reporting. Legends don't add embarrassing details. Now, I'm going to give you an example here. I hope I don't step on any toes. We got any Texans? Really? Okay, a couple of, three, all right. So, what's your image of Davy Crockett? I always think of the old John Wayne movie. He fires the gun until he runs out of bullets, and then he's got the musket going, right? And the Texans are get down to the last man. He's probably the last guy there, and the Mexicans just swarm him, and that's it. But he went down fighting. Well, there's a guy not too long ago who wrote, as a historian, he wrote what he thinks really happened. He thinks Davy Crockett surrendered and was just put to death, just skewered later. Well, that hurts, right? That would hurt if you're a buyer into the whole legendary thing. He got death threats. The guy that wrote that, because people were so upset. You're ruining our legend.
I want to know that guy's name now.
He's in the God Conversation, that book. Yeah. A second guy says, all right, so he wanted to write about the Alamo. He says, William Travis. You recognize that name? He was there. William Travis was a playboy, and he had syphilis. Sam Houston, the guy who later defeats Santa Anna's army, he was a drunkard.
Yes.
And Jim Boy, famous knife guy, he was running, he ran up debts all over the place. He was just kind of running to get away from people that were chasing him down to get money that he owed them. So, I mean, can you see? Legends, they skip all that stuff, right? They don't want the dirt. They just want to tell this wonderful story. But really, Jesus, were there embarrassing details about the crucifixion and the resurrection? The crucifixion, how about start with that? Who do you put on a cross? The lowest of the low. That was terrible to a Jew. There was nothing worse than to die by crucifixion. You're a most awful individual. Cursed is the person that's hanged on the cross. So it says even in the Old Testament. And Jesus is on the cross. What's he saying? My God, what? Why have you forsaken me? He doesn't sound real heroic at that point. He doesn't say, no problem, I'm doing fine. Don't worry about me. But that's some embarrassing stuff. And of course, we already talked about that. The disciples running from him, saying they don't know him, don't want to deal with him. They're hiding out. So legends don't do this. Here's another problem with legends when it comes to the New Testament. They take a long time to get going because King Arthur, apparently there probably was an original person that became the kernel for all these stories about King Arthur. Around 500 AD was his life. But look how long it took until you start getting stories about him. You recognize that name, Mordred? Bad guy? Merlin, right? All the magic and sorcery and stuff. And it wasn't until, how many years? 600 plus years before you get all the stories of the knights and things like that. So it takes a long time. People study this stuff. Now, how long does it take to get an original story developed into a legend? A long time. Here's one more example. Charlemagne. So he's living around 800 AD. It took about 200 plus years before the first legend about him happened in this poem called the Song of Roland. So again, we're talking hundreds of years. So resurrection stories, though, in the New Testament, they didn't go 7,500, 200, 300 years before those stories started happening. They were fast. They were really fast. So I need to spend just a second on something that is found throughout the New Testament. They're little beautiful golden nuggets of things called creeds. So a creed is a way to teach somebody in kind of a short form something that you think is really important. Like today we have mission statements for businesses. So it's kind of like a mission statement, but it'd be about Jesus. So let me give you one example. I'm going to read it in a second here. It's in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, I got something that I'm going to pass on to you in the Corinthian church. So Paul's not making up this creed. That's what's going to be important. Scholars are dating this creed. Now, it's not Paul. Remember, he's got this creed They're dating the creed to within just a few months of the resurrection. So here's the creed. Christ, you probably recognize it, it's pretty famous. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried, that he was raised on the third day. Remember, this is within months of the resurrection. According to the scriptures, he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. He appeared to more than 500. We already read about that. Most of whom are still living. What's Paul saying?
Eyewitnesses.
Yeah, go check them out. They're alive. They're around. Though some have fallen asleep, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. So this is, they've looked at the way the language is used in here. It's not Paul's writing. It's not his language. It's not his style. It comes from the time period that when he went to Jerusalem to find out about the Christian faith when he first became a Christian. And he was given this creed then. And there are a lot of creeds in the New Testament, by the way. It's not just in the Paul's letters. So when were the Gospels written? I think that's kind of important if we're going to talk about, how close, so we don't get these legends, how close are the Gospel accounts. So I'm going to run kind of a timeline backwards, if that makes sense. I'm going to start here. Many scholars buy into this, not all, I just want to warn you, it's not all across the board, but many of them buy into this, that Acts, the book of Acts, is probably early 60s as far as its creation. Now, the reason they say that is there are certain things that are not in the book of Acts that would have been there. They were really important to the Jews, but they're not in there because they hadn't happened yet. What do you think of? What happened in 70 AD? The temple's down. Was that a big deal? Yeah, it was huge. It showed God was kind of like walking away from his people. They were just devastated and hauled off to slavery. And it was a big deal. Plus, who predicted that the temple was going to come down? Jesus did. So if you're writing Acts after 70, you're going to put that in there. You're going to say the temple came down and Jesus predicted it, so he's therefore the Messiah. But you don't get that at all. You know what else is not in there? Peter and Paul, martyrs, dying. It's not in the book of Acts. They're alive all the way through. But a guy named Stephen, they spend, Luke spends like, a chapter and a half just on the death of Stephen. Now, no offense to Stephen, but he wasn't up there in the major leagues with the other disciples. Don't you think if Luke is writing this thing and he knows that Paul has died, and he knows that Peter's died, that would have been in there? It's not. So because of those things, I think you can make a really good case early 60s for Acts. Let's back this off a little bit. Is Acts the first book by Luke? It's kind of a giveaway question. It's like who's buried in Grant's tomb? Yeah, Luke was earlier than Acts. Luke says it, in my previous book, he starts off Acts. So Luke is written before Acts. So what are we doing? We're probably moving Luke into the late 50s, somewhere in there. And is Luke the first of the Gospels written? No, most critics say Mark was before that. So look where we're going, 60s, 50s, maybe even late 40s or early 50s. Now that's getting really close. If Jesus is in the 30s, what are we talking about, 15 years, 20 years? So what's the point of all of this? You don't have enough time for the legends to develop. That's all I'm doing, just trying to talk about the whole legend thing at this point. What about hallucinations? There's a very famous doctor who's put out a book on hallucinations. His name is Oliver Sacks. He's fun to read. He's actually a really interesting guy. So this has been kind of a theory that's been developing lately. Well, the disciples just missed him so much. They all hallucinated this. Jesus showing up, Jesus talking to him, Jesus taking him out and feeding him, and all that kind of stuff. Well, do you see any problems with that, by the way? So you got the hallucinations to the disciples, hallucination to Paul, and hallucination to James.
They all have to see the same thing.
Yeah, they all have to see the
500 at once? That's not possible.
No, that doesn't happen. Were these two people looking forward to Jesus and feeling so bad that he had died?
Nope.
These were not believers. Paul was out persecuting Christians, and James, the brother, said Jesus is nuts when he was around then, and so he wasn't a believer. So you can't say, well, why would they hallucinate this Jesus? They didn't want Jesus to be showing up there. They've done studies. Hallucinations are experiences that are going on in here. They have no connection to the outside world, so you don't have group hallucinations. That makes no sense. It'd almost be like this. You're sitting with a friend somewhere and you kind of doze off and you wake up and you go, wow, that was a great dream. I was on a beach in Hawaii. Why don't you fall asleep and join me in my dream? Yeah, that's not going to happen, right? It's just not going to happen. Hallucinations also don't come and go. Jesus is around for 40 days and then he's gone. Now, if it's a hallucination, it's either going to continue or it's going to be, off and on. I mean, it just seems kind of weird. Here's one last approach. We'll end on this one. Do you recognize the name Gary Habermas? He is the leading expert on the resurrection. He writes books, just books by themselves, just on the resurrection. So what he has done, he spent a lot of time on this. He has investigated what historians who have studied the resurrection, what they had to say. Not just Christians, but those who are agnostic and those that are totally opposed. But they're good historians, so they say, well, this is what we think happened. And he puts that all together and he calls it the minimal facts, meaning what do most historians buy into and say they think happened? Now watch, it's not going to be the total Christian message, but it's going to be so good that you can use this to talk to other people and say, well, if historians buy into these things up here, how do you explain the resurrection except that it really happened? So, they all agree Jesus died on a cross. Okay, so the Romans knew what they were doing. They don't mess around. If you're given the ultimate penalty, they're going to carry it out. You don't mess with Romans. Number two, the tomb was empty. Most historians buy into that. Okay, empty tomb. Most historians say the disciples thought. Notice it doesn't say that Jesus really showed up. After all, we're talking about historians who aren't Christians. So they thought they saw Jesus after his death. And the last one is James and Paul converted to Christianity. All right, well, let's try this for just a minute. There are other theories that they try to plug in instead of the true resurrection to try to explain what happened that don't work with these four items up here. So let's try one. Jesus really didn't die on the cross. He just swooned. That's been a theory for quite a while. In other words, he came off the cross. They thought he was dead. Put him in the tomb. He came to, showed up to his disciples. And they said, "You're the Son of God." Does this work? I mean, first of all, do you think you would distinguish between a guy who just came out of a tomb that just barely escaped death and think that was the Son of God? You'd say, you are one lucky person. Lie down. You're dragging bits of the cloth and that you're still oozing all the wounds and everything like that. And you just, it doesn't make any sense at all. Plus, how does that convince James and Paul? Why would they be convinced? What about this? The women went to the wrong tomb. Well, take them to the right tomb. But they're saying, no, there really wasn't any body in that tomb. So that goes away. You get done, you kind of think, well, what else could it be? This kind of defeats the idea of any natural explanation for the resurrection. Especially James and Paul, who didn't have any interest in that. They didn't want there to be a resurrection. Then it comes down to, and this is what bothered J. Warner Wallace, he said, okay, you got all this information here, but it all depends on a miracle. Right? If you don't buy into miracles, people that die stay dead. End of story. There's got to be some naturalistic explanation. So, can you argue for the existence of miracles? I'm going to put some items up here, but I wanted you to think about that for just a minute. You don't have to answer, but could you make an argument for the existence of miracles? Sure. We ought to be able to. Here's the first one. Steve and I have been talking quite a bit about science. How does science tend to argue for the existence of God?
Big Bang. The Big Bang.
The Big Bang. You need a Big Banger. You got life. How'd you get life here? How'd you get design and complexity? How'd you get the rise of consciousness? Where did morality come from? You got all these things that go away if there's no God, but they seem to, these things seem to be there, and science seems to suggest it's pointing toward the existence of a creator. So if you got God in the mix of things, then miracles are not a problem, are they? Already God is supernatural. He's beyond the natural world. The New Testament's reliable. Here's another way that you can believe in miracles. There are a lot of good books out there. I love the Cold Case Christianity, but there are a bunch of others that argue for the reliability of the New Testament, which reports on miracles. Many Americans have experienced miracles. I just brought one book with me I wanted to show you. something like a quarter of Americans say there are such things as miracles. And there's a book called Signs and Wonders in America Today. Really interesting stuff. If we had time, I'd read some of them to you. Things where people have been, clinically dead or had major problems, physical problems, and have been cured. So many Americans have experienced them. Miracles don't violate natural laws. I don't know why people always bring that up. They say, well, it can't be miracles, you're violating natural laws. Okay, if I take this book and I drop it and catch it, did I violate the law of gravity? What did I do? I interrupted it. That's all I did. So God is not violating laws, he's interrupting the law, the natural law. So that always seemed like a kind of a silly argument. Here's another one, just because you've never seen one. Have you ever heard that one? Well, I've never seen a miracle. Okay, you haven't seen electrons either, I bet. So there's evidence out there. So can you believe in miracles? Yeah. And if you can believe in miracles, the resurrection is not a problem. Neither is the virgin birth, by the way. You don't think God can create chromosomes and work magic that way? So conclusion, the resurrection wasn't a lie, it wasn't a legend, it's not a hallucination. He is risen. Good news, huh? Best of news. One challenge to all of us, I just came across this the other day, Rebecca McLaughlin, she's a really good Christian writer. People, and this is a challenge I want to leave with all of us here, people need to hear what difference the resurrection would make. I don't want us all walking out here saying, yeah, I think the resurrection happened. So, once you get in your car and you go home and you talk to neighbors, you're doing stuff with your family, what difference is it making in our lives? And that's what she's talking about. They need to see it in our lives, that we're different, we're changed people because of the resurrection. If we're not living as if Jesus is truly Lord, he's not just a guy that lived in the first century, he's come back from the dead, he's got the right to tell us how to live a life. Our unbelieving friends won't have any motivation to wish the resurrection was true, which is often the first step to believe that it's true. So you got to start with the wish in it. In other words, they look at us and they go, what's different about you? And you say, I believe the resurrection, I believe Jesus is alive, he's done things in my life. Oh, that'd be kind of cool. Why would I, and then you take the next step, why would I want that in my life? What's the proof of it, right? So they start with what sounds good because they've seen your life. They've seen the things that you've done. They go, okay, I kind of like that. And then you can tell them the things that we've been talking about tonight. So plenty of good books. That'll be on the handout that I give